Speaker, on the issues that have been brought in this motion, touching on the widow and the children of the late Governor for Nyeri, Gachagua. And Mr. Speaker, I wondered if adverse statements and inferences have been made touching on the conduct of the Deputy President against the widow of the former governor and the children of the late governor, the nephews of the Deputy President. Why, Mr. Speaker? I ask as a father, why, Mr. Speaker, did the widow and the children of the late Governor Gachagua swear an affidavit to dispel all the things that have been said against a scheme of swindling those children? Why, Mr. Speaker? Why didn't they swear an affidavit, Mr. Speaker? That has troubled me a lot. And as I cast my vote tonight, Mr. Speaker, I'll be casting my vote for those children who lost their mother, who lost their father, but who were not given an opportunity, Mr. Speaker, to appear before this House and tell us, Mr. Speaker, that there has not been any wrongdoing from the Deputy President to those children. Count number 1, count number 8 is about the utterances that were made by the Deputy Speaker. I hope, Mr. Speaker, that the person who will occupy that coveted position of Deputy President will reflect on what John says in chapter 3, verse 5. Mr. Speaker, the Bible says that the tongue is a small part of the body, but the tongue is also fire, and it's a world of evil among parts of the body. If the Deputy President had checked these utterances, Mr. Speaker, perhaps we will not be having this motion this evening. So, as we vote tonight, Mr. Speaker, let's also learn. Let's also learn from what the tongue has done to Honorable Gachagua. I will vote, Mr. Speaker, where I'm convinced that allegations against the Deputy President have been proved. I reserve my vote to be cast at the right time.
Senator Boni.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the position of the Deputy President of Kenya is very high. It is a very high calling. And therefore, Mr. Speaker, as we make a decision on the Deputy President of Kenya, I want to remind him that of those to whom more is given, indeed, more is expected of them. And he should not feel that he is being victimized because, Mr. Speaker, the highest standard of this Constitution in 2013, by dint of lack of integrity, the Deputy Chief Justice, Nancy Barasa, lost her job merely because she pinched the nose of Kwamboka. The Deputy President indeed did worse than pinching the nose of somebody. Mr. Speaker, the Deputy President, seeing the allegations against him, I can't imagine that he moves around with the moninga of man of faith and truthful man. Mr. Speaker, if really we must talk about faith, may I remind the Deputy President of a man of faith, a man of letters called Bill Paul. Bill Paul said, man of faith, that integrity is like virginity. You lose it only once. And when you lose it, you can never get it back. The Deputy President has lost that virginity of leadership. Mr. Speaker, coming from a community that paid for the price of inflammatory speeches in Likoni, in Molo, and in Trans Nzoia, If I had time, I would discuss what some of my relatives went through, including Pastor Liai from Ichina village. Mr. Speaker, during the tribal clashes of 1992 and 1997. I would like to remind the Deputy President of the post-election violence of 2007, 2008. One of the reasons why we had to have this progressive constitution that will be removing him, hopefully, this evening from office. Mr. Speaker, even as we ask the Deputy President to leave office, we must insist that the DCI and the ESCC and other investigative institutions must pursue this matter beyond this vote. I have on mind, Mr. Speaker, the activities of the intricate web of companies up to 22, so to speak. The reason I believe young Mutuse could not bring all this, dear senators, colleagues, is because effort requires money, requires time to do all that research. Some of them you have to do clandestine for you to get information. I believe that if the Deputy President had taken the dog, we were going to completely undress him. We would have asked him to justify what activities each and every one of those companies was doing. It's part of the reason why he stepped down, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I have evidence, which I don't wish to be part of the case, that as soon as the Deputy President's brother died, the wife went to the corporate branch of the cooperative bank and started crying there that the manager should stop the Deputy President from operating these accounts. Mr. Speaker, finally, the Deputy President must be investigated for the role.
Senator Eddy.
Mr. Speaker, I thank you, and I recognize the pressure of time. Mr. Speaker, I am here because of the kindness of the people of Migori County who sent me here that at such a time, Mr. Speaker, I need to be cautious of the Article 125 of the Constitution, which requires us as a House that in matters such as this, Mr. Speaker, we must behave like judges, because under Article 125 of the Constitution, Mr. Speaker, we sit as a High Court, Mr. Speaker. And in the words of Socrates, Mr. Speaker, a judge is required to listen courteously, to answer wisely, to consider soberly, and definitely to decide impartially, Mr. Speaker. There were 11 charges, Mr. Speaker, that were put before us, Mr. Speaker, and they were put to us in the context of Constitution 2010, Mr. Speaker. The Constitution 2010, Mr. Speaker, came in the backdrop of two very important historic moments in this country, Mr. Speaker, that I must reflect on, Mr. Speaker. Number one, Mr. Speaker, is the section paper number 10 of 1965, Mr. Speaker. That section paper number 10, Mr. Speaker, divided this country into those who are important and those who are not important. The language that was used then, Mr. Speaker, was the idea of northern frontier districts, Mr. Speaker, that then discriminated upon some communities, Mr. Speaker, against others, Mr. Speaker. Number two, Mr. Speaker, in 2007, Mr. Speaker, this country was divided on the basis of ethnicity, Mr. Speaker. And therefore, I rise to support this motion if my grounds, Mr. Speaker, after listening courteously and considering soberly, Mr. Speaker, are more than half of the charges, Mr. Speaker. And I find that ground 1, 5, and 6 on the utterances of the Deputy President, Mr. Speaker, violate Article 91 of the Constitution and Article 232 of the Constitution. We cannot have political parties, Mr. Speaker, that are founded on the basis of ethnicity and dividing national resources on the basis of ethnicity, Mr. Speaker. Number two, Mr. Speaker, that would make the ground number 4, which actually also happened to be reason number 4 for why the Deputy President must leave office, Mr. Speaker, the violation of Article 160 of the Constitution, Mr. Speaker, of undermining the judiciary, Mr. Speaker. There was an imminent threat to the judges there, Mr. Speaker. You realize that in my judgment, Mr. Speaker, I excuse ground number 8 on the basis of the fact that there was no proof that there was a petition that was not filed, Mr. Speaker. But on the threat, Mr. Speaker, I think that the Deputy President stands impeached, Mr. Speaker. Ground number 9, Mr. Speaker, on NIS, Mr. Speaker. We know that this country has faced serious terror attacks, Mr. Speaker. And the moment the Deputy President, Mr. Speaker, showcases the secrecy of deficiency in our security infrastructure, Mr. Speaker, and you know that under Article 240, he has platforms to be able to express himself, Mr. Speaker, it is a violation of the Constitution, Mr. Speaker. Lastly, on ground number 11, Mr. Speaker, on bullying KEMSA official, Mr. Speaker, it has been proven here beyond reasonable doubt, Mr. Speaker, that the Deputy President is not a member of the company that was listed. He's not an employee of that company, Mr. Speaker, yet he goes ahead and makes calls on behalf of that company, Mr. Speaker. That is impeachable. Lastly, Mr. Speaker, I must call the Council of the Deputy President to order, Mr. Speaker, especially Council Paul Muite, Mr. Speaker, for actually practicing law in deceit, Mr. Speaker. You cannot say that at the level of the Deputy President, Mr. Speaker, that was listed. He's not an employee of that company, Mr. Speaker. Yet he goes ahead and makes calls on behalf of that company, Mr. Speaker. That is impeachable. Lastly, Mr. Speaker, I must call the Council of the Deputy President to order, Mr. Speaker, especially Council Paul Muite, Mr. Speaker, for actually practicing law in deceit, Mr. Speaker. You cannot say that at the level of the Deputy President, Mr. Speaker, that he was listed. He's not an employee of that company, Mr. Speaker. Yet he goes ahead and makes calls on behalf of that company, Mr. Speaker. That is impeachable. Lastly, Mr. Speaker, I must call the Council of the Deputy President to order, Mr. Speaker, especially Council Paul Muite, Mr. Speaker, for actually practicing law in deceit, Mr. Speaker. You cannot say that at the level of the Deputy President, Mr. Speaker, that he was listed. He's not an employee of that company, Mr. Speaker. Yet he goes ahead and makes calls on behalf of that company, Mr. Speaker. That is impeachable. Lastly, Mr. Speaker, I must call the Council of the Deputy President to order, Mr. Speaker, especially Council Paul Muite, Mr. Speaker, for actually practicing law in deceit, Mr. Speaker. You cannot also say that at the level of the Deputy President, Mr. Speaker, that he was listed. He's not an employee of that company, Mr. Speaker. Yet he goes ahead and makes calls on behalf of that company, Mr. Speaker. That is impeachable. Lastly, Mr. Speaker, I must call the Council of the Deputy President to order, Mr. Speaker, especially Council Paul Muite, Mr. Speaker, for actually practicing law in deceit, Mr. Speaker. You cannot also say that at the level of the Deputy President, Mr. Speaker, that he is listed. He's not an employee of that company, Mr. Speaker. Yet he goes ahead and makes calls on behalf of that company, Mr. Speaker. That is impeachable. Lastly, Mr. Speaker, I must call the Council of the Deputy President to order, Mr. Speaker, especially Council Paul Muite, Mr. Speaker, for actually practicing law in deceit, Mr. Speaker. You cannot also say that at the level of the Deputy President, Mr. Speaker, that he is listed. He's not an employee of that company, Mr. Speaker. Yet he goes ahead and makes calls on behalf of that company, Mr. Speaker. That is impeachable. Lastly, Mr. Speaker, I must call the Council of Deputy President to order, Mr. Speaker, especially Council Paul Muite, Mr. Speaker, for actually
case that the deputy president is a symbol of national. I don't have to think about that. It's not the case of the speaker. Mr. Speaker, if you go ahead and for 131 to say that the deputy president by virtue of Article 147 respect and uphold and protect the constitution. That is not the case. The deputy